双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Discourses on Satire and Epic Poetry by John Dryden. Introduction. Dryden's discourses upon satire and epic poetry belong to the latter years of his life, and represent maturer thought than is to be found in his Essay of Dramatic Poesy. That essay, published in 1667, draws its chief interest from the time when it was written. A Dutch fleet was at the mouth of the Thames. Dryden represents himself taking a boat down the river with 3 friends, one of them his brother-in-law Sir Robert Howard, another Sir Charles Sedley, and another Charles Sackville Lord Buckhurst, to whom, as Earl of Dorset, the Discourse of Satire is inscribed. They go down the river to hear the guns at sea, and judge by the sound whether the Dutch fleet be advancing or retreating. On the way they talk of the plague of odes that will follow an English victory. Their talk of verse proceeds to plays, with particular attention to a question that had been specially argued before the public between Dryden and his brother-in-law Sir Robert Howard. The question touched the use of blank verse in the drama. Dryden had decided against it as a worthless measure, and the chief feature of the essay, which was written in dialogue, was its support of Dryden's argument. But in that year, 1667, Paradise Lost was published, and Milton's blank verse was the death of Dryden's theories. After a few years, Dryden recanted his error. The Essay of Dramatic Poesy is interesting as a setting forth in 1667 of mistaken critical opinions which were at that time in the ascendant, but had not very long to live. Dryden always wrote good masculine prose, and all his critical essays are good reading as pieces of English. His Essay of Dramatic Poesy is good reading as illustrative of the weakness of our literature in the days of the influence of France after the Restoration. The essays on satire and on epic poetry represent also the influence of the French critical school, but represent it in a larger way, with indications of its strength as well as of its weakness. They represent also Dryden himself, with a riper mind covering a larger field of thought, and showing abundantly the strength and independence of his own critical judgment, while he cites familiarly and frequently the critics, little remembered and less cared for now, who then passed for the arbiters of taste. If English literature were really taught in schools, and the eldest boys had received training that brought them in their last school year to a knowledge of the changes of intellectual fashion that set their outward mark upon successive periods, there is no prose writing of Dryden that could be used by a teacher more instructively than these discourses on satire and on epic poetry. They illustrate abundantly both Dryden and his time, and give continuous occasion for discussion of first principles, whether in disagreement or agreement with the text. Dryden was on his own ground as a critic of satire, and the ideal of an epic that the times, and perhaps also the different bent of his own genius, would not allow him to work out, at least finds such expression as might be expected from a man who had high aspirations, and whose place, in times unfavorable to his highest aims, was still among the master poets of the world. The discourse on satire was prefixed to a translation of the satires of Juvenal and Persius, and is dated the 18th of August, 1692, when the poet's age was 61. In translating Juvenal, Dryden was helped by his sons Charles and John. William Congreve translated one satire. Other translations were by Nahum Tate and George Stepney. Time modern reader of the introductory discourse has first to pass through the unmeasured compliments to the Earl of Dorset, which represent a real esteem and gratitude in the extravagant terms then proper to the art of dedication. We get to the free sea over a slimy shore. We must remember that Charles II upon his death was praised by Charles Montague, who knew his faults, as the best good man that ever filled a throne, and compared to God himself at the end of the first paragraph of Montague's poem. But when we are clear of the conventional unmeasured flatteries, and Dryden lingers among epic poets on his way to the satirists, there is equal interest in the mistaken criticisms, in the aspirations that are blended with them, and in the occasional touches of the poet's personality in quiet references to his critics. The comparisons between Horace and Juvenal in this discourse and much of the criticism on Virgil in the Discourse on Epic Poetry are the utterances of a poet upon poets, and full of right suggestions from an artist's mind. The second discourse was prefixed in 1697, 3 years before Dryden's death, to his translation of the Aeneid.
H.M.
A discourse on the original and progress of satire, addressed to the Right Honourable Charles, Earl of Dorset and Middlesex, Lord Chamberlain of His Majesty's household, Knight of the most noble order of the Garter, etc. My lord, the wishes and desires of all good men, which have attended your lordship from your first appearance in the world, are at length accomplished, from your obtaining those honours and dignities which you have so long deserved. There are no factions, though irreconcilable to one another, that are not united in their affection to you, and the respect they pay you. They are equally pleased in your prosperity, and would be equally concerned in your afflictions. Titus Vespasian was not more the delight of humankind. The universal empire made him only more known and more powerful, but could not make him more beloved. He had greater ability of doing good, but your inclination to it is not less. And though you could not extend your beneficence to so many persons, yet you have lost as few days as that excellent emperor, and never had his complaint to make when you went to bed, that the sun had shone upon you in vain, when you had the opportunity of relieving some unhappy man. This, my lord, has justly acquired you as many friends as there are persons who have the honour to be known to you. Mere acquaintance you have none. You have drawn them all into a nearer line, and they who have conversed with you are for ever after inviolably yours. This is a truth so generally acknowledged that it needs no proof. It is of the nature of a first principle, which is received as soon as it is proposed, and needs not the reformation which Descartes used to his. For we doubt not, neither can we properly say, we think we admire and love you above all other men. There is a certainty in the proposition, and we know it. With the same assurance I can say, you neither have enemies, nor can scarce have any, for they who have never heard of you can neither love or hate you, and they who have can have no other notion of you than that which they receive from the public, that you're the best of men. After this, my testimony can be of no farther use than to declare it to be daylight at high noon, and all who have the benefit of sight can look up as well and see the sun. It is true, I have one privilege, which is almost particular to myself, that I saw you in the east at your first arising above the hemisphere. I was as soon sensible as any man of that light when it was but just shooting out and beginning to travel upwards to the meridian. I made my early addresses to your lordship in my Essay of Dramatic Poetry, and therein bespoke you to the world, wherein I have the right of a first discoverer. When I was myself in the rudiments of my poetry, without name or reputation in the world, having rather the ambition of a writer than the skill, when I was drawing the outlines of an art, without any living master to instruct me in it, an art which had been better praised than studied here in England, wherein Shakespeare, who created the stage among us, had rather written happily than knowingly and justly, and Johnson, who, by studying Horace, had been acquainted with the rules, yet seemed to envy to posterity that knowledge, and, like an inventor of some useful art, to make a monopoly of his learning, when thus, as I may say, before the use of the lodestone or knowledge of the compass, I was sailing in a vast ocean without other help than the pole star of the ancients and the rules of the French stage amongst the moderns, which are extremely different from ours, by reason of their opposite taste. Yet even then I had the presumption to dedicate to your lordship a very unfinished piece, I must confess, and which only can be excused by the little experience of the author and the modesty of the title, an essay. Yet I was stronger in prophecy than I was in criticism. I was inspired to foretell you to mankind as the restorer of poetry, the greatest genius, the truest judge, and the best patron. Good sense and good nature are never separated, though the ignorant world has thought otherwise. Good nature, by which I mean beneficence and candor, is the product of right reason, which of necessity will give allowance to the failings of others by considering that there is nothing perfect in mankind, and by distinguishing that which comes nearest to excellency, though not absolutely free from faults, will certainly produce a candor in the judge. It is incident to an elevated understanding like your lordship's to find out the errors of other men, but it is your prerogative to pardon them, to look with pleasure on those things which are somewhat congenial and of a remote kindred to your own conceptions, and to forgive the many failings of those who, with their wretched art, cannot arrive to those heights that you possess from a happy, abundant, and native genius which are as inborn to you as they were to Shakespeare, and, for aught I know, to Homer, in either of whom we find all arts and sciences, all moral and natural philosophy, without knowing that they ever studied them. There is not an English writer this day living who is not perfectly convinced that your lordship excels all others in all the several parts of poetry which you have undertaken to adorn. The most vain and the most ambitions of our age have not dared to assume so much as the competitors of Themistocles. They have yielded the first place without dispute, and have been arrogantly content to be esteemed as second to your lordship, and even that also with a longo, sed proximi intervallo, if there have been, or are, any who go farther in their self-conceit. They must be very singular in their opinion. They must be like the officer in a play who is called captain, lieutenant, and company. The world will easily conclude whether such unattended generals can ever be capable of making a revolution in Parnassus. I will not attempt in this place to say anything particular of your lyric poems, though they are the delight and wonder of the age, and will be the envy of the next. The subject of this book confines me to satire, and in that an author of your own quality, whose ashes I will not disturb, has given you all the commendation which his self-sufficiency could afford to any man, the best good man, with the worst-natured muse. In that character, methinks, I am reading Johnson's verses to the memory of Shakespeare, an insolent, sparing, and invidious panegyric, where good nature the most godlike commendation of a man is only attributed to your person, and denied to your writings. For they are everywhere so full of candor, that, like Horace, you only expose the follies of men without arraigning their vices, and in this excel him, that you add that pointedness of thought which is visibly wanting in our great Roman. There is more of salt in all your verses than I have seen in any of the moderns, or even of the ancients, but you have been sparing of the gall, by which means you have pleased all readers and offended none. Donne alone, of all our countrymen, had your talent, but was not happy enough to arrive at your versification, and were he translated into numbers and English, he would yet be wanting in the dignity of expression, that which is the prime virtue and chief ornament of Virgil, which distinguishes him from the rest of writers, is so conspicuous in your verses that it casts a shadow on all your contemporaries. We cannot be seen, or but obscurely, while you are present. You equal Donne in the variety, multiplicity, and choice of thoughts. You excel him in the manner and the words. I read you both with the same admiration, but not with the same delight. He affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with the softnesses of love. In this, if I may be pardoned for so bold a truth, Mr. Cowley has copied him to a fault, so great a one, in my opinion, that it throws his mistress infinitely below his Pindarics and his later compositions, which are undoubtedly the best of his poems, and the most correct. For my own part, one must avow it freely to the world that I never attempted anything in satire wherein I have not studied your writings as the most perfect model. I have continually laid them before me, and the greatest commendation which my own partiality can give to my productions is that they are copies, and no farther to be allowed than as they have something more or less of the original. Some few touches of your lordship, some secret graces which I have endeavored to express after your manner, have made whole poems of mine to pass with approbation. But take your verses all together, and they are inimitable. If, therefore, I have not written better, it is because you have not written more. You have not set me sufficient copy to transcribe, and I cannot add one letter of my own invention of which I have not the example there. It is a general complaint against your lordship, and I must have leave to upbraid you with it. That, because you need not write, you will not. Mankind that wishes you so well in all things that relate to your prosperity, have their intervals of wishing for themselves, and are within a little of grudging you the fullness of your fortune. They would be more malicious if you used it not so well and with so much generosity. Fame is in itself a real good, if we may believe Cicero, who was perhaps too fond of it, but even fame, as Virgil tells us, acquires strength by going forward. Let Epicurus give indolency as an attribute to his gods, and place in it the happiness of the blessed. The divinity which we worship has given us not only a precept against it, but his own example to the contrary. The world, my lord, would be content to allow you a seventh day for rest. Or, if you thought that hard upon you, we would not refuse you half your time. If you came out, like some great monarch, to take a town but once a year, as it were for your diversion, though you had no need to extend your territories. In short, if you were a bad, or, which is worse, an indifferent poet, we would thank you for our own quiet, and not expose you to the want of yours. But when you are so great, and so successful, and when we have that necessity of your writing that we cannot subsist entirely without it, any more, I may almost say, than the world without the daily course of ordinary providence, methinks this argument might prevail with you, my lord, to forego a little of your repose for the public benefit. It is not that you are under any force of working daily miracles to prove your being, but now and then somewhat of extraordinary, that is, anything of your production is requisite to refresh your character. This, I think, my lord, is a sufficient reproach to you, and should I carry it as far as mankind would authorize me, would be little less than satire. And indeed a provocation is almost necessary, in behalf of the world, that you might be induced sometimes to write, and in relation to a multitude of scribblers, who daily pester the world with their insufferable stuff, that they might be discouraged from writing any more. I complain not of their lampoons and libels, though I have been the public mark for many years. I am vindictive enough to have repelled force by force if I could imagine that any of them had ever reached me. But they either shot at rovers, and therefore missed, or their powder was so weak that I might safely stand them at the nearest distance. I answered not the rehearsal, because I knew the author sat to himself when he drew the picture, and was the very base of his own farce, because also I knew that my betters were more concerned than I was in that satire, and, lastly, because Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, the main pillars of it, were two such languishing gentlemen in their conversation that I could liken them to nothing but to their own relations, those noble characters of men of wit and pleasure about the town. The like considerations have hindered me from dealing with the lamentable companions of their prose and doggerel. I am so far from defending my poetry against them that I will not so much as expose theirs. And for my morals, if they are not proof against their attacks, let me be thought by posterity what those authors would be thought if any memory of them or of their writings could endure so long as to another age. But these dull makers of lampoons, as harmless as they have been to me, are yet of dangerous example to the public. Some witty men may perhaps succeed to their designs, and, mixing sense with malice, blast the reputation of the most innocent amongst men, and the most virtuous amongst women. Heaven be praised! Our common libellers are as free from the imputation of wit as of morality, and therefore whatever mischief they have designed they have performed but little of it. Yet these ill writers, in all justice, ought themselves to be exposed, as Persius has given us a fair example in his first satire, which is levelled particularly at them, and none is so fit to correct their faults as he who is not only clear from any in his own writings, but is also so just that he will never defame the good, and is armed with the power of verse to punish and make examples of the bad. But of this I shall have occasion to speak further when I come to give the definition and character of true satires. In the meantime, as a counselor bred up in the knowledge of the municipal and statute laws may honestly inform a just prince how far his prerogative extends, so I may be allowed to tell your lordship, who by an undisputed title are the king of poets, what an extent of power you have, and how lawfully you may exercise it over the petulant scribblers of this age. As Lord Chamberlain, I know, you are absolute by your office in all that belongs to the decency and good manners of the stage. You can banish from thence scurrility and profaneness, and restrain the licentious insolence of poets and their actors in all things that shock the public quiet, or the reputation of private persons, under the notion of humor. But I mean not the authority which is annexed to your office. I speak of that only which is inborn and inherent to your person. What is produced in you by an excellent wit, a masterly and commanding genius over all writers, whereby you are empowered, when you please, to give the final decision of wit, to put your stamp on all that ought to pass for current, and set a brand of reprobation on clipped poetry and false coin. A shilling dipped in the bath may go for gold amongst the ignorant, but the scepters on the guineas show the difference. That your lordship is formed by nature for this supremacy, I could easily prove, were it not already granted by the world, from the distinguishing character of your writing, which is so visible to me that I never could be imposed on to receive for yours what was written by any others, or to mistake your genuine poetry for their spurious productions. I can farther add with truth, though not without some vanity in saying it, that in the same paper written by divers hands, whereof your lordship's was only part, I could separate your gold from their copper. And though I could not give back to every author his own brass, for there is not the same rule for distinguishing betwixt bad and bad as betwixt ill and excellently good, yet I never failed of knowing what was yours and what was not, and was absolutely certain that this or the other part was positively yours, and could not possibly be written by any other. True it is that some bad poems, though not all, carry their owner's marks about them. There is some peculiar awkwardness, false grammar, imperfect sense, or, at the least, obscurity, some brand or other on this buttock or that ear that it is notorious who are the owners of the cattle, though they should not sign it with their names. But your lordship, on the contrary, is distinguished not only by the excellency of your thoughts, but by your style and manner of expressing them. A painter judging of some admirable piece may affirm with certainty that it was of Holbein or Van Dyck, but vulgar designs and common drafts are easily mistaken and misapplied. Thus, by my long study of your lordship, I am arrived at the knowledge of your particular manner. In the good poems of other men, like those artists, I can only say, this is like the draught of such a one, or like the coloring of another. In short, I can only be sure that it is the hand of a good master. But in your performances it is scarcely possible for me to be deceived. If you write in your strength, you stand revealed at the first view, and should you write under it, you cannot avoid some peculiar graces which only cost me a second consideration to discover you. For I may say it with all the severity of truth, that every line of yours is precious. Your lordship's only fault is that you have not written more, unless I could add another, and that yet greater. But I fear for the public the accusation would not be true that you have written, and, out of a vicious modesty, will not publish. Virgil has confined his works within the compass of 18,000 lines, and has not treated many subjects, yet he ever had, and ever will have, the reputation of the best poet. Martial says of him that he could have excelled Varius in tragedy and Horace in lyric poetry, but out of deference to his friends he attempted neither. The same prevalence of genius is in your lordship, but the world cannot pardon your concealing it on the same consideration, because we have neither a living Varius nor a Horace, in whose excellences both of poems, odes, and satires, you had equaled them. If our language had not yielded to the Roman majesty, and length of time had not added a reverence to the works of Horace. For good sense is the same in all or most ages, and course of time rather improves nature than impairs her. What has been, may be again. Another Homer and another Virgil may possible arise from those very causes which produce the first, though it would be impudence to affirm that any such have yet appeared. It is manifest that some particular ages have been more happy than others in the production of great men in all sorts of arts and sciences, as that of Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and the rest. For stage poetry amongst the Greeks, that of Augustus for heroic, lyric, dramatic, elegiac, and indeed all sorts of poetry in the persons of Virgil, Horace, Varius, Ovid, and many others, especially if we take into that century the latter end of the Commonwealth, wherein we find Varro, Lucretius, and Catullus, and at the same time lived Cicero and Sallust and Caesar. A famous age in modern times for learning in every kind was that of Lorenzo de' Medici and his son Leo X, wherein painting was revived, and poetry flourished, and the Greek language was restored. Examples in all these are obvious. But what I would infer is this, that in such an age it is possible some great genius may arise to equal any of the ancients, abating only for the language. For great contemporaries whet and cultivate each other, and mutual borrowing and commerce makes the common riches of learning,